and hopefully everyone can see that. Just let me know if there's any issues with audio or visuals. So yeah, I'm Joe. Like Kate said, I'm a PhD student, just about still going, in human geography at Newcastle University in the Northeast. And I have been engaging with degrowth as a concept and also as kind of community, if you like, since about 2015. And so I've kind of incorporated it into my research at both master's and now PhD level, mainly focusing on the idea of degrowth as a kind of discourse that can be engaged with and employed by activists, grassroots environmental activists. And I'm also part of degrowth.info, which is one of the kind of primary websites of the international degrowth movement. So I would encourage people to go and check that out if you want to find out more about degrowth after tonight. So what is degrowth? It's a concept that can be quite hard to pin down just because it's a term that's used in so many different ways by different people. But I'm just going to try and focus in on some of the very basics in this short period of time before we move on to a discussion. So I'm going to start from kind of degrowth's intellectual roots, which are in ecological economics. So in kind of mainstream economics, you often hear of the economy as kind of just being described as detached from the environment, and ecological economics takes a very like contesting view to this. So ecological economics says that society and therefore the economy are embedded within the environment. And so for this reason, when we're designing our economic systems, we need these systems to operate safely within the biophysical environment so that they don't undermine the ecological systems which sustain life on Earth. And this is kind of the basis from which degrowth's analysis emerges. So the problem that arises then is that the currently dominant economic system of capitalism has a growth imperative. And by that, I mean it's predicated on infinite economic expansion. So with corporations, obviously, there's a pursuit of ever increasing profits. And then at the level of the nation state, there's a pursuit of GDP growth year upon year. And the kind of typical target that states use is for a 3% increase in GDP each year, which doesn't sound like too much, but then when you account for this being compound growth year on year, it equates to a doubling of the total size of an economy every roughly 24 years. So that then sounds quite striking. And obviously, as we know, when growth is then interrupted, we see things like recession, austerity, unemployment, poverty, and usually, if not always, the most vulnerable members of society being hit the hardest. So these are all kind of things that are cited as reasons why we have to maintain growth continuously. And maybe that would be okay if growth was just a number, but it's not just a number, unfortunately. And all of this economic growth has to be fueled in some way. And for this reason, GDP growth is tightly tied with the use of natural materials from the Earth. So the graph on the right here shows the annual change in global GDP mapped against the annual change in material footprint, which is an indicator of the total amount of natural materials used by an economy, in this case, the global economy. And you can see that in the space of this graph since 1990 to 2016, there's a really close relationship between the change in global GDP and the change in material footprint. And basically, what this represents is an increasing use of materials, which then puts increasing pressure on various ecological systems, and eventually triggering processes of ecological breakdown. So this is just a first indicator of some of the ecological impact of growth. And another way we can look at this indicator of material footprint is a couple of graphs here. So on the left, you've got, again, global material footprint broken down into the various different materials within that. And the red line going across the screen here is the kind of level that's deemed by researchers to be sort of the sustainable maximum level of material use. And you can see that obviously we've shot past that since the 90s by quite some way. But another important way to look at it is also the distribution of this material use. So on the right-hand side, you can see the global material footprint broken down into different nations. And obviously, you can see the high income nations and some upper middle nations as well account for the vast majority of the Earth's total material use. And then the low income nations for very little of it. So this is important because it's the first indication as well of the kind of colonial character of ecological breakdown and responsibility for ecological breakdown. So that's the first indicator. And then another indicator we can look to is carbon emissions. So as we know, GDP growth so far has been fueled pretty much entirely by fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels for energy. And so this time on the right in the graph, we have global GDP mapped against atmospheric carbon CO2 levels. And again, you can see there's a relationship here. And the red line this time is at the kind of well-known 350 parts per million level, which is deemed as the kind of maximum level of carbon we can have in the atmosphere. And again, we've obviously shot past that level, that threshold, since the 80s. So although there has been some kind of more localized cases of decoupling of growth from carbon emissions, and countries like the UK will cite that in regards to their domestic carbon emissions. As a globe, the whole world, GDP and levels of carbon in the atmosphere are still increasing together, as you can see in the graph. And again, we can look at that in a couple of different ways. So here it is, levels of carbon emissions broken down by different parts of the world. So on the left, you can see, again, the sort of vast disparity in responsibility for climate breakdown. So you've got the USA having contributed 40% of atmospheric carbon levels, EU 29%, and then the rest of the global north as well. And then the global south having only contributed percent. So again, quite dramatic disparity of responsibility between different nations. And then on the right-hand side, again, this is mapped kind of over time. So you can see when these emissions have occurred and how they've accumulated and gone past that 350 parts per million threshold. And again, you can see the kind of vast disparity there between the global north and global south. So again, another indication of the kind of the colonial dimensions of climate breakdown and ecological crisis more broadly. So a question then is, how, as a society, global society, do we respond to these problems that growth brings about? Well, the dominant kind of response is what's known as green growth. And this is basically the idea that GDP can be decoupled from its ecological impacts, so the ecological impacts that I've just described. And this is a kind of narrative or framing, however you want to call it, that's popular basically across the entire political spectrum. So that includes like the major international institutions like the UN, OECD, the World Bank, but also even like on the left as well, with other like activists and politicians. And there's two different types of decoupling that we can talk about really. So on the one hand, as you can see in this diagram here, you can have relative decoupling. So that's when GDP is still increasing and environmental pressures or impacts are increasing just at a slower rate than GDP. And then you can also have absolute decoupling. And this is when GDP is increasing, or theoretically is when GDP is increasing and environmental pressures are decreasing. And as we've seen in the previous graphs, we know that we need absolute decreases in these ecological impacts that I've outlined in order to get back down to those sustainable levels that were indicated by the red lines. So green growth relies therefore on the kind of possibilities that through technological innovations, we're going to find a way to bring about this absolute decoupling so we can have continued growth whilst reducing ecological impacts of that growth. But unfortunately, there's increasing evidence that green growth is not, can't be relied upon to address the climate and ecological crisis. So there's some research by Jason Hickel's just been mentioned before, and Yorgos Kallis, and they've got a really good paper on this called Is Green Growth Possible? And they do a big study and basically find that there's no empirical evidence for sustained absolute decoupling of GDP growth from material use at a global scale. And then secondly, in regards to carbon emissions, while it is possible to decouple GDP and carbon emissions, like in one state, for example, it's not possible at a global scale or the necessary speed that we need in order to limit global warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees rise above pre-industrial levels. And that's because, put simply, the larger the energy use of an economy, the longer and the more difficult it is to decarbonize that energy use. So green growth doesn't pan out in reality as well as it's kind of promised. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. I've just put a few examples on here, and there's more that are not here, but some of the main ones, you've got rebound effects. So this is when an activity becomes more efficient, more ecologically efficient. It usually becomes cheaper to do that activity. And so we often kind of lose any potential ecological gains because we simply increase our consumption of that activity. So an example that's often used in this case is getting a more fuel efficient car, but just driving more miles than you would have done before because it's cheaper. And then you lose any potential ecological gains. You've also got problem shifting. So this is, well, a good example here, an obvious example is that while renewable energy obviously reduces carbon emissions dramatically, it increases other ecological pressures. So things like pressures on land, since renewable energy requires a lot more land to deliver the same amount of energy than fossil fuels. And also extraction of the materials that are needed to build things like solar panels and wind turbines. a lot of these materials often being extracted in the global south as well. Thirdly, you've got cost shifting as well. So this is when one example is high income nations who kind of claim to have decoupled GDP from carbon emissions, for example, say. This is often kind of an accounting trick, if you like, that's predicated on the exporting of ecologically damaging production processes to other parts of the world. So usually to low-income nations in the global south, where there's more lax environmental and labour regulations. So it's not that that impact has disappeared, it's just that it's been shifted to a different location or a different sector. And then finally, you've got the kind of fact that the promised sort of technological innovations needed for green growth just haven't really emerged at a scale that we need. An obvious example there, which many people will be familiar with, is carbon capture and storage as something that hasn't emerged at a big enough scale to address ecological crisis yet. Okay. So if we can't rely on green growth to address climate and ecological crisis, then obviously we need to look for alternative options. And this is where we can look to degrowth as one such option. So degrowth is a planned social transformation which reduces aggregate material and energy use to sustainable levels, whilst also tackling inequality and enhancing well-being. And at first, that might not sound very distinct from ideas of green growth, but the important point is that degrowth recognizes that in order to reduce aggregate material and energy use, by reducing that, we can expect that growth will, GDP growth will reduce as well for the reasons that I've just mentioned. So degrowth says, in that case, we need to transform our society and our economies in order to figure out ways that we can maintain and enhance well-being whilst having a declining GDP and declining material and energy use. So how do we do that? Well, degrowth kind of says that there's actually already more than enough material wealth in the world to satisfy everyone's needs. It's just that that wealth is very, very unevenly distributed, and it's hoarded by the very richest in our society. So from there then, degrowth is something that is needed in high income nations of the global north, as we've seen on the graphs earlier, in order to kind of reduce the vast material footprints and historical emissions of those countries that those countries have been responsible for. And it's not just a coincidence that those countries have high ecological impacts historically, and global south has contributed less so to climate and ecological crisis. That's very much because the high income nations have reached that position based on exploitation of the global south. So degrowth is about rebalancing material wealth between nations on the one hand, and that's its kind of the decolonial impulse of degrowth, if you like. But it's also about rebalancing within nations as well. So degrowth also recognizes the kind of vast levels of inequality within these high income nations that need degrowth. So it recognizes that the vast majority of ecological impacts within high income nations come from the richest in society and corporations, especially like the fossil fuel industry. So another key point then is that degrowth is fundamentally anti-capitalist, because, as I said earlier, capitalism is a system that relies upon infinite economic growth, and so degrowth is necessarily anti-capitalist for that reason. So it entails moving beyond capitalism. So what will it kind of look like? Well, how do you reduce aggregate material and energy use whilst enhancing well-being? Obviously, some sectors that are causing this ecological damage need to decrease in size, need to shrink, and possibly completely. So things like fossil fuels, aviation, advertising, and certain types of finance are possible examples, but also many others. And then sectors that are kind of contributing positively to social and ecological well-being, we want to see them flourish. So things like renewable energy, healthcare, public transport, ecosystems, restoration, education, and you could think of many other examples. So a key point then is that degrowth is not just about less in a blanket sense, less for everyone, less in all sectors. It's contextually dependent, right? So degrowth is focused on these high income nations, and within that, it's focused on specifically on corporations and the highest contributors to ecological degradation. But it's also focused contextually in terms of the different sectors that it wants to see shrink or flourish, respectively. So what would a degrowth transformation or degrowth society look like? Well, there's a lot of different visions out there because degrowth is in itself quite a pluralistic movement, if you want to call it that. But there's a few things that are kind of shared, maybe pretty broadly across different people's visions. So a big one is decommodification. So shifting towards a society where people can meet their needs through things like commons and public services rather than relying on income and wage labor. More localized economies with lower ecological impact. Political decentralization as well is a big part of degrowth visions. So giving more autonomy to local communities. Moving away from GDP as a metric towards different measures of social and ecological well-being. And then also things like repayment of ecological debt to the global south from the global north because of the vast disparities for historical ecological impacts that I've shown before. Okay, so another important question then is how to bring about degrowth, right? So strategy is something that has been conceived of quite loosely, I think it's fair to say, so far within degrowth, and it's something that is only just now in the last year or so becoming a much more focused topic of discussion. And there was a conference specifically on the topic of strategy and degrowth last year. But generally, so far, there's been kind of three main strands of strategy that people have talked about. So firstly, you have what's often called oppositional activism. And this is, I guess, something very familiar to people involved with XR. So things like civil disobedience, direct action and protests. And obvious kind of targets for that are the industries that are contributing most to climate and ecological breakdown. So fossil fuels, aviation being two obvious examples. But degrowth also recognizes that we can't just oppose the things we don't like. We've also got to start building our own new institutions within the current society. So this usually happens at kind of quite a local scale, decentralized scales. And those institutions include things like food, housing, energy cooperatives, ethical banks. And then the final kind of strand of strategy within degrowth is what is sometimes called radical reforms. And these are often taken the form of policy initiatives that we can pursue and implement within existing institutions and political systems. So there's a lot of policies that are very popular within degrowth circles, so things like universal basic income or universal basic services, job guarantees, maximum income and shorter working weeks. So all different policies that can kind of pave the way towards a degrowth transformation in some way. The final thing that I'm going to mention, just because it was I was asked to talk about it, is how degrowth relates to the Green New Deal. So obviously the Green New Deal is quite a big, significant political opening at the moment, and a very live discourse. And it's something that represents an opportunity to become one of these like radical reforms, as I've just described. But so far, most Green New Deal proposals kind of aim to have this win-win situation, if you like. So they're kind of often aiming to decarbonize the economy, yes, but also they're kind of coupling this with an aim to spur more growth, right? And as we know, as we've already discussed, a growing economy is going to be harder to decarbonize. And it also means rebound effects in terms of more material use. So degrowth approaches the Green New Deal as something positive, but it says we actually need a Green New Deal, which, yes, it aims to decarbonize and enhance well-being, but it also explicitly needs to reduce levels of energy material use in high-income nations. So that needs to be built into a way that the Green New Deal is designed in a country like the UK. And so degrowth has kind of been calling for versions of the Green New Deal that are built around considerations like global environmental justice. So not just looking about the impacts of a Green New Deal within one country, but looking at its global impacts in terms of environmental justice. So we need to consider like communities within the parts of the world where the materials to build these renewable energy technologies will be extracted. So areas of the global south, for example, and the impacts that that's going to have in those areas. Degrowths are also looking at principles like common ownership models, job guarantees, green universal services, resource caps, tackling inequality, and of course, moving beyond growth as a whole. So yeah, the Green New Deal is certainly a political opening and something that degrowth wants to try and influence within the direction of a degrowth kind of transformation, and try and turn into one of these radical reforms that can then lead to a wider transformation of the economy. And the Green New Deal for Europe is probably a good place to look if you're interested to see a version of the Green New Deal that's already out there that is had input from people like Jason Hickel and degrowth writers and researchers. And yeah, I'm going to leave it there. And there's a couple of questions now for the discussions and to guide the discussions. And I'll hand back over to Kate to tell us how that's going to proceed.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. Well, lots to talk about and lots to think about. I've seen there are already a couple of questions in the chat. Either take those into your breakout room or hang on to them until for 20 minutes or so. And we can include those in the questions and answers at the end. So the questions, what we're going to do now is split you into groups of about 8 people. And you'll be able to discuss these 2 questions amongst yourself. Strongly suggest that each group chooses somebody to facilitate so that somebody doesn't just talk all over you, or not that any of us would, but just to make sure that everybody gets a fair say. And also decide who is going to report back, who is going to sum up what you've talked about and make that available to the whole group at the end. So those are the 2 things. And the questions are, should environmental movements call explicitly for degrowth, or does it sound too